Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Hi, Dr. Paul.
Good. Well, we have a good subject today, a very positive story, and I think everybody in America probably heard about it, even though they might have been glued to their TV and listening to the latest speech on immigration and what we should do to build a wall. But we're going to be talking about a wall being torn down, and we're excited about it because it's something you and I have worked together when we were in Washington to try to get to this day. Of course, what I'm talking about is the first flight to Cuba in 55 years. You know, the last time they flew one, I was still in medical school. And so it's been a long time ago that we had a commercial flight. And this went well. And the headlines, historic commercial flight from US lands in Cuba. Another one, Cuba could draw 300,000 visitors from the U.S. this year. And, of course, when we were fighting this and trying to get this to happen, there was a lot of resistance in the Congress because they said, oh, if you do that, that'll make Castro look good. But, of course, our position on free trade is obviously clear. The more you trade and talk with people, the less likely we're going to fight with people. So I think you recall the few times that we had to debate this issue, and incrementally we probably made some progress while we were in Washington.
Yeah, I think it was one of the great stories. You know, when I first came to work for you in 2001, I sort of inherited that from my predecessor, Joe Becker, and working on this. It was really a bipartisan coalition. And I know you worked very hard behind the scenes. You were involved in a lot of these meetings. Jeff Flake was involved, a lot of people on the Democratic side. And through those years, the momentum really built, and it was incredible how much it built. And I think now, while we should definitely credit President Obama for this opening, I think, as you always say, it's an idea whose time has come, and you can't stop it with armies.
No, and I think that is it. When you think of some of the things that have happened in the negative and the positive, when the people, you know, are desperate and want change, they might rally around a bad idea, and bad things happen. But, you know, when you think about the collapse of the Soviet system, that was an idea that had to be eliminated because the time had come where the people didn't support it. And this is what's happening here. I mean, it's just so disheartening, you know, over the years, the American people and Cuban Americans who had family back there still would like to send just some simple things that we couldn't conceive of it. Toilet paper and Kleenexes and things like that. They weren't allowed to do this, and all of a sudden things have changed. So we criticize them all the time, and Obama deserves a lot of criticism in a lot of the foreign policy, but this is really good that is happening. It reminds me a little bit about the pros and cons of what Nixon did. And Nixon actually did opening with the China a little more secretively than even this. People knew these negotiations were going on, so the opposition was building. So I think it's something that we should be very pleased with, and I think it's going to benefit the Cubans, the Cuban people, and the American people. And, of course, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we don't have an authoritarian approach to government right now, because I think we can see that the market has already spoken on this. All of a sudden, prices have gone down.
Yeah, it used to be, there was a great AP piece that the New York Times carried, and it used to be, of course, you had to jump through innumerable hoops to get it. Then you'd be waiting in line for hours to get a $500 ticket, you know, to go to Cuba for Cuban Americans who wanted to visit their relatives. But according to the article, you know, this one woman was quoted. She went online for JetBlue for $98. She got a ticket, didn't have to wait at all. She paid $35 for some extra luggage weight. She brought kitchen tiles, a dress, some ice cube trays, you know. Imagine 300,000 people bringing this all the time, you know, and what it's going to do for trade and for relations.
Actually, instead of it hurting the Cuban administration, people are going to feel better. They're going to be wealthier. The country is going to be more helpful. There's going to be more cash inflow, investment in that country, which means they're going to be richer. Yeah. What are they going to do with their riches and the dollars that they get? they're going to spend those dollars in the United States. People say, well, this is just helping the Cubans. They're going to have our dollars. But they're not going to put the dollars in a shoebox. What they're going to do is they will spend these dollars. You know, in one of the things we argued when this issue came up was the farming issue, because we had a lot of rice farmers in the district here that remembered selling a lot of rice to Cuba. It's a short distance away, and it was really a good thing. I think some of the agricultural sales have already occurred, but this should open up the doors to a lot of things. This is not done perfectly yet. Matter of fact, there's one little technicality that is not being for tourists, but the idea is that the door is now open, and the wall has come down, and I think we're going to see positive things if we can just contain the government's temptation to want to take over again. I was kidding, but it's probably serious. I said, yeah, now that we've done this, we'll probably force them into NAFTA immediately instead of just letting the companies and the people benefit from a program like this.
It's true that the wall has come down, and the wall was built by both sides. Primarily for us, it's built by our government. But one of the thematic things that we find attractive, the philosophical things we find attractive, is that this sea change has made both governments less relevant in the Cuba-U.S. ties. Now you can go over there. You don't have to have an official government tours. You don't have to have government-guided tours. You don't have the U.S. government hounding you. And so it sort of shrinks the influence of government away from travel between the U.S. and Cuba. And that's got to be a good thing.
Yeah. When this was happening, of course, Fidel is still alive in his 90s. I was thinking, I wonder what's going through his head, because it looks like there's a lot of positive excitement there. Anyway, people have to give up the ideas, and times have changed. But when you think back, the Castro movement that occurred in 1959, the takeover, it's not like the good guys were in power. We had and the bad guys, the communists, took over and created this. It was never quite that simple, because that was our hands are not clean with the Batista government, and that was going on off and on, for a couple decades, but especially during the 50s. So from 52, I think, up to 59, Batista was in charge, and he was far from an angel. And this is the whole thing. People, we support governments, and they do things, and they're not good for the people, and then that incites the more radical group. And I think we could argue that's sort of what happens in the Middle East. We support, the Saddam Husseins, and then people disapprove of it. They dislike what we do, and then the radicals who can stir up trouble and say, look, this is terrible, this is terrible. I think that's what happened, back in the 50s. When you read about all the things, he was not a civil libertarian. Matter of fact, he was president twice in the early 40s. He was an elected president, and the one thing that he did, that Batista did, was right after Pearl Harbor. He was an ally of the United States, so the next day he declared war along with the United States. But of course, what's Cuba going to do against Japan? But it's interesting that he declared war against Germany, and he had a new constitution, and he was known as a populist who believed in civil liberties. But the second go-around, he lost leadership in the late 40s. So when he was sort of cast aside, he says, well, I thought I'd be safer if I were in the United States. So he comes to the United States. But I saw him not at that time, but now. He was just a CIA guy that we had. And then he went back in the 50s, early 50s. And he got permission to come back. He started a new party, and and they permitted him to run for office. But the election wasn't going well. And, of course, the American government was behind him. It wasn't going well, so he had a military coup. And he takes over the government. Guess who's the very first country to recognize his government? Because it was democratically elected with this democratic coup. The United States immediately supported him, and they did it all through the 50s. And his record for civil libertarians was atrocious.
Yeah. And you mentioned before, by the way, that reminds me so much of Ukraine, doesn't it? You overthrow the government, and that's the. But you mentioned that despite some of his more positive things, that Eisenhower really had a lot to do with the origin of this enmity between the two countries.
Yeah, and it was Eisenhower. It was probably the Dulles brothers.
Yeah.
And, we reviewed the one book, the Kinzer book, about how both Dulleses, really ran it. And at the time, most people, I remember Eisenhower so well as a president. And most people said, well, he just sort of doesn't pay attention, and people run things. But that wasn't the case. He was very, very much involved. But, it was a mixed bag. It seems like Eisenhower had this obligation to participate in world events and to protect our interests in the oils and things like that. But he didn't believe in sending troops. He did, I guess, to Lebanon once, but that wasn't his thing. Matter of fact, he was known and most remembered for stopping the fighting in Korea. And I think the interesting about Eisenhower, too, even though he did these things, even like in Iran, and throughout the elected leader Mossadegh, but he opposed and strongly opposed the use of nuclear weapons on that final conclusion of World War II against Japan. He thought it was totally unnecessary, and now the honest historians, when they look back, it had nothing to do with ending the war. The war was over by then. So Eisenhower, played a role in it, but we'd like to go that one step further and not endorsing a government that behind the scenes and secretly get involved in coups and CIA operations and elections, and if we don't like the elections, we get rid of them. So it plants bad seeds, and just think of how Cuba suffered over this and how we all suffered over it, and then we had the Bay of Pigs and all these things afterwards.
It goes to show that he could be right about not wanting to invade places, but the problem is the interventionism, whether it's secret or what have you, because as you point out, all the bad seeds that later came, Indonesia, in Latin America, in Iran, all of the things that we're still facing today, were planted by this interventions, and we can turn the dials and control the world.
Yeah, and the historians have shown that during the 50s, when Batista was in power, the real control was really, they called it the American Mafia, and they were individuals that controlled the gambling, the drugs, and the whole works. So it was one of those things, and commercial interest too. So they were very, very powerful. So the big question is on this change that's occurring, Are they going to become more libertarian, and are they going to look at this and say free trade and movement is wonderful, and are we going to keep going in that direction, or are we going to say, well, we need more internationalism, and we need them in the IMF, we need to control their finances, we need to have them participating in TSA, we need to put them into NAFTA, and all these things. So there's a lot yet, but still, it's still very, very positive. I think we need the emphasis now on how you keep making progress. And like I mentioned to you, I said, now is the opportunity. Hopefully the best export we can send to Cuba is not the concept of Hillary's American exceptionalism, which is American militarism, but American exceptionalism at a time when it used to be freedom and civil liberties and free markets. And I'd like to export a few ideas like Austrian economics. I mean, now that would really be. Today, I'm sure there's still some restrictions on that, and we're in this country having less freedom of speech and speaking out than ever before. But as long as we have opportunity to keep ideas alive, and when the time comes, when an idea whose time has come, the armies can't stop it. The Cuban armies can't stop it. The Russian, Soviet armies couldn't stop the Berlin fall. So that is why we should never give up on promoting supporting our cause, and we say, well, we keep losing. They might say, how many times did you vote for this, Ron? Never passed. Yeah. So it was a wasted time. No, but ideas were changing, conditions were changing, and the people finally decided that they wanted something different. So I do truly believe that the government people have is a reflection of the people's attitudes. It's just not instantaneous enough. It's hard to measure. But I think right now we're going through a turmoil in our election because the ideology hasn't quite changed enough people, and there's still a lot of people who are on the entitlement system, both the rich and the poor, and they're not talking about liberty. They're talking about entitlement and power and control and who's going to run the world. And so that's a completely different subject than what I'm talking about because there's no reason why we can't continue to be optimistic in talking about issues and finally seeing some progress.
Yeah, and as you said, it's not perfect. There's still not tourism travel. You have to fit into a few categories to get over there. But that's more a technicality. But as of December, there will be direct flights from Houston, Los Angeles, New York, Miami, and Fort Lauderdale. So direct flights from Houston. And I was just thinking as I was reading this, we've got our conference coming up here in a couple of weeks or a week or so. Maybe we'll be able to do our next conference in Havana. That would be pretty neat, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, now that they can fly out of there, what would be neat, too, is if a Cuban individual lover of freedom would come to our conference, because they might be interested. But I understand that you even had the opportunity to make a trip to Cuba once, and it was probably a worthwhile experience. And what year was that? Do you recall?
That was 2003, and here's the thing. Because you were in Congress and I was a staff member, we were privileged, so we were allowed to travel. Just the Americans who paid our salaries weren't allowed to travel, But it was fascinating, and everyone there wanted to open up to the U.S.
Even the Cuban people that you talked to there.
Absolutely. Everyone wanted to. So we're finally getting there.
Well, wonderful. You couldn't just get on an airplane, even though you were part of a government group going there. You couldn't go direct. You had to go through Mexico to get there.
That's right.
Very good. Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report because we're very pleased to have this because I think it's a very positive step moving in the direction of the argument how do you prevent hot wars? And you prevent it mostly by more travel, more combination of sales and trade. Trade prevents the wars. And so this is the right direction. But like we said, it still is a long way to go to keep the authoritarians from creeping in and taking over once again. But for now, the authoritarians lost. The people who believed in freedom of trade and freedom of movement and a more open society, they have had a victory, and I think it is very positive. I hope it will continue. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.